verses 1 through 12. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Remember, as we read these verses, most likely all of the Christmas stories and the birth narratives that we read in the Gospels of Matthew and in Luke are probably the memories of Mary, who would have told those stories to Jesus throughout his childhood and life, who would have related those stories to the disciples and probably to the evangelists who recorded them. So Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born, King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." Now when King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there, ahead of them, went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. The words of God for God's people. Of course, in response to this, Joseph receives a dream, and he takes Mary and Jesus to Egypt, where they will be refugees in the earliest part of his years, and then return to Palestine as soon as Herod is dead, where Jesus will grow up in the town of Nazareth of Galilee. Let us pray. O Lord, we ask your blessing upon these words. Help us to enter into them, to recognize the wisdom that was demonstrated by those who came seeking to celebrate and worship Jesus, to recognize where their wisdom comes from and where wisdom begins in our own lives. Amen. During an average year, most of us have opportunity of introducing others to people. In fact, I hope our greeters do that every Sunday. Whenever there's a visitor, be sure to grab 2 or 3 people and introduce them to one another so that they have a chance to celebrate their visiting presence with us. And we may do that in any number of ways. For example, we might introduce someone on the basis of their vocation, what it is they do. We might say, well, this is Tom, and he's an engineer for Water and Light. Or we might do it on the basis of a relationship. This is Suzanne. She's the daughter-in-law of Eleanor and Bob. Or we might do it on the basis of a salient characteristic. This is my nephew James. He's a real athlete, we might say. Well, Matthew, the evangelist, introduces us to three really wise guys: Casper, Melchior, and Balthazar. Now, tradition, rather than the biblical text, is what gives us those three names. And in fact, the number, we don't really know how many of Magi there were. It's assumed there were three because three gifts are mentioned. But Matthew does clearly state that they were wise men from the east. What made them wise? We're told elsewhere in Scripture that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I don't think that really means that we're afraid of God, although we do respect the power that God has. But rather that God is the source of our knowledge, the gift of the world that we live into, the genesis of our very being. And any knowledge or wisdom that seeks to work apart from that is going to be folly right from the starting gate. These magi who come from the east, we don't really know what cultural tradition they came from or what their religious perspectives were. We do know that they were curious, that they were students of the world in which we live. One of the traits that I've always admired about my wife is that she is a lifelong learner. She's a natural educator, and any time that she's speaking to others, she's kind of educating as she does it. It's just who she is. And she's constantly learning something more about the world in which we live every single day. These magi were people who had a curiosity for life, who wanted to discover all the secrets of nature. They were astrologers. They were watching the heavens. And they noticed what nobody else seemed to. You would expect that those who were schooled in Torah, who had studied it all in their lives, who were watching the signs, would have noticed this extraordinary happening in the heavens, but they did not. And yet these three, or however many there were, come from the east, searching, because they know that God has done something unusual, momentous, world-transforming. That just as that star appeared in the heavens, there was a star appearing on earth. And they knew that he was the King of the Jews. So when they arrive, they immediately go to Herod's palace and consult him, assuming that he, of all people, will know where this child is and who he is. And they want to be able to go and to celebrate him. They've made a verb of their study. Their journey is kinetic. I often think, well, what would it take for me to notice something in nature in the heavens and to take such a journey? And yet that's exactly what they did, extraordinary as it was, seeking to celebrate the gift of this child. And they come to Herod saying, "Where is the one born King of the Jews? We've seen the star at his rising, and we've come to pay him homage," or "We've come to worship him." And that, I think, is the seed and genesis of their wisdom. That in their heart of hearts, they want to worship and celebrate this one who is born in the world in which we live. And so they go to Herod and they seek counsel and help. And Herod, of course, doesn't know anything about this, and he immediately feels threatened. He's frightened by what he hears because he is the king of the Jews, and he doesn't want there to be another one, whether it's divinely inspired or not. So he calls for his scholars, his rabbis, the learned ones who know Torah inside and out, and asks them what it reveals. And they said, well, the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem. Though it is small, and many think insignificant, it is not the least among the nations, for from Bethlehem will come one who will rule God's people in spirit and in truth. So it is that the wise men learn from the Scriptures. Listen to the text that is there and ask the question, how may I find this Jesus? Well, didn't know his name, but this Messiah that God has given. The Scriptures are given to us to be a light and a guide. And Bible study really is something that we all do well to do every single day of our life. To spend some time reading through the Scriptures, even if it's a single verse, and to focus and meditate upon it and ask God what it would teach us or reveal to us. Back in October, I began a Bible study journey. I think it was October. And every 2 weeks, we have an opportunity for those who wish to come. In fact, Tuesday night we'll be gathering at 6:30 here. We're going through the Gospel of Luke and would love to have you join us. We do Bible study, of course, every Sunday when we are preaching, when you hear the message that is shared. But this kind of Bible study is different because it allows all of us to explore the questions together. To ask of the verse who, what, where, when, how. What does this say about the human nature? What does this say about God? What does this say about the relationship between God and humans? And what are the implications that we can learn that will guide us in life? Let your light shine before others that they might see your good works and glorify God who is in heaven. So the wisdom for the wise men, I think, comes first from their desire or impulse to worship, but also from being students of the Holy Scriptures. We're told that once they receive the news, they head out, and of course, it's the star, actually, that guides them to exactly where Jesus is. It's interesting to me that Herod doesn't send some of his others to follow and to find out where this Jesus is. It's interesting to me that the scholars and rabbis aren't interested to go and find out and investigate what this is all about, but they don't seem to do that. Herod is sort of relying upon the kings to come back and tell him the story so that he can go not to worship Jesus, as he says, but to eliminate his competition. Well, the wise men see the star, and they come to the place where Mary and Jesus are, and they bring out their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, celebrating and paying homage, worshiping this one that God has sent and placed among us. And then what does it say? And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Even in their dreams, they were listening for God's voice, God's guidance, taking note of what it is that God would guide them to do. And so they don't return to Herod. They recognize that Jesus has been put in jeopardy, and they return to their country by another route. I would suggest that their wisdom comes from their relationship with God, that they can discern the voice of God. And the only way you can recognize the voice of God is when it is in the context of relationship. When we meet someone and we begin a friendship with them, you see, that's something that we do together. It can't be done just by one of the people. It has to be done by both. Both are contributors to that relationship as it is formed. And the same thing is true in our relationship with God. Sometimes people will say, well, God feels far away. I don't feel like God is right here with me. How can I be close to God? Well, the truth is we do that by interacting with God, by asking questions. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open. Ask and it shall be given to you. pressed down, shaken together, and running over. God will pour it into your lap. God wants us to ask and to reach out and inquire. Gideon was one of the judges of the Hebrew Testament, and he was called upon to lead the people of Israel into a battle. And he wasn't certain that he heard God just right, and that's okay. It's all right when we're not positive that we've heard God just right. And so he came up with a strategy, and he said to God, God, I'm going to put this fleece of a sheep out here on the ground, and if it's wet in the morning and the ground is dry, then I'll know that you were speaking to me. Well, he did so, and in fact it was wet and the ground was dry. And he said, well, I might have still misunderstood, so let's try this again. This time I'll put it out, and if the fleece is dry and the ground is all wet, then I'll know that you were speaking to me. And of course, that's exactly what he found, because God was, in fact, speaking to him. It's okay to put out a fleece, to interact with God and to ask questions. God delights in revealing the divine heart to those who seek God. It's one of the gifts of who we are. When I was little, I experienced this in a pretty powerful way that has kind of guided me through life. When I was 5 years old, I can remember going to church and to Sunday school, and the lesson that day was drawn from Samuel. It was about a boy who was not much older than I was, who was sleeping in the temple because he was helping out in the sanctuary there in the tabernacle, and he heard a voice speaking to him, and ultimately discovers that it's the voice of God calling to him. And I remember coming home from that church service, and after dinner, going out into the woods, and I did what I often did, which was to take walks and sort of talk with God. Kind of like the way Tevye would in Fiddler on the Roof, for those who may have seen the film, these constant conversations that would go on between Tevye and God. And I would talk with God, and I remember saying, God, what is it you want me to be? And as clear as I could hear it, the answer was to become a